Hellcat pilots didn't just fear enemy fighters. Most of them never even died in dogfights. The real killer of US Navy pilots in the Pacific War was something far more unexpected. It wasn't the legendary Japanese Zero. It wasn't even enemy fire most of the time. By the end of this video, you'll see why simply learning to fly this aircraft was more dangerous than fighting Japan's best pilots in the sky. When the Pacific War erupted, American pilots were thrown into a brutal reality check. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero had already been fighting over China for more than a year, and in that time it had built a reputation among those who faced it. But across the Pacific, many US officers had dismissed reports of its performance. The victories were chalked up to poor enemy aircraft, inexperienced pilots, and exaggerated battlefield rumors. The Zero was not seen as a technological threat. It was seen as propaganda. That illusion shattered in December 1941. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier aircraft swept aside American defenses with frightening ease. In the months that followed, the Zero carved out air superiority across much of the Pacific. American pilots climbing into their fighters quickly discovered that they were at a disadvantage. In turning fights, the Zero could outmaneuver them. In climbs, it could gain altitude faster. In the early encounters, trying to fight the Zero on equal terms often ended with burning wreckage falling into the sea. What made the Zero so formidable was its design philosophy. Japanese engineers built it around extreme lightness. Armor plating was stripped away. Fuel tanks were left unprotected. Every kilogram saved went into improving speed, range, and maneuverability. The result was an aircraft that could dance through the sky, outturning and outclimbing most Allied fighters early in the war. But this performance came at a cost. The Zero's pilot sat in a cockpit with little protection. A few well-placed rounds could ignite fuel or tear through the airframe. Early in the war, however, this weakness rarely mattered. The Zero's agility allowed skilled pilots to avoid being hit in the first place. For American pilots flying the F4F Wildcat, the experience was humbling. They were slower, heavier, and less nimble. In one-on-one engagements, they were simply outmatched. Even as American aircraft struggled, pilots began adapting. One of the most important innovations came from Commander John Thatch. Realizing that Wildcats could not outturn Zeros, Thatch developed a cooperative tactic that used teamwork instead of raw maneuverability. By flying in pairs and crossing paths during an attack, American pilots could trap a pursuing Zero in a deadly crossfire. This tactic saved lives. It gave pilots a way to survive encounters that would otherwise have been unwinnable. But it was not a solution to the underlying problem. The US Navy still lacked a fighter that could meet the Zero on equal terms. Tactical ingenuity could only go so far when the aircraft itself was fundamentally inferior in key performance areas. Behind the scenes, Grumman was racing against time. The company had been working on a new fighter design, initially intended as an improvement over the Wildcat. The war transformed this modest upgrade into an urgent national priority. The result was the F6F Hellcat. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat was not built around extreme lightness. It was built around survivability. Fate intervened in a remarkable way. In 1942, American forces recovered a largely intact Japanese Zero that had crash-landed in the Aleutian Islands. The aircraft had gone down in soft terrain, and although the pilot was killed, the airframe remained in surprisingly good condition. For Allied engineers, this was a gold mine. The captured Zero was carefully repaired and tested. What they discovered changed how American pilots would fight. At high speeds, the Zero's manual controls became heavy and unresponsive. The airframe began to vibrate violently in steep dives. The aircraft performed poorly at high altitude, where thinner air reduced engine power. These weaknesses suggested a new approach to combat. Avoid turning duels, fight in the vertical, and use speed to dictate the engagement. These lessons fed directly into the Hellcat's final design and tactical doctrine. The Hellcat would not try to outturn the Zero. It would outlast it, outdive it, and outclimb it at altitude. The Hellcat was powered by a massive radial engine producing far more horsepower than the Zero's power plant. It carried armor plating around the cockpit, bullet-resistant glass in front of the pilot, and self-sealing fuel tanks that dramatically reduced the risk of fire. Where the Zero was delicate, the Hellcat was rugged. This ruggedness mattered far beyond the battlefield. Carrier aviation placed extreme demands on both aircraft and pilots. Landings were violent, decks were short. A missed approach often meant slamming into parked aircraft or plunging into the ocean. The Hellcat's forgiving handling characteristics made it far more suitable for this environment than many other fighters. It stalled at lower speeds, gave pilots more warning before losing control, and recovered from spins more easily. In other words, the Hellcat was designed not just to win fights, but to keep inexperienced pilots alive long enough to become experienced ones. When Hellcats finally entered combat in large numbers, the shift was dramatic. In their early encounters with Japanese fighters, American pilots discovered that the Zero's once-feared dominance had faded. Hellcats could absorb punishment that would instantly destroy a Zero. They could dive away at speeds the Zero could not safely follow. And at altitude, they held a clear advantage. This did not make Zero pilots harmless. In close, slow-speed turning fights, the Zero remained dangerous. Experienced Japanese pilots could still exploit its agility. But the overall balance had changed. American pilots now controlled when and how engagements happened. They could choose to disengage, climb away, and return for another pass. The numbers told the story. Hellcats achieved overwhelming victory ratios against Japanese fighters. The Zero was no longer the terror of the skies. It was now a vulnerable opponent facing an aircraft designed with the brutal realities of war in mind. Here is the part of the story that surprises most people. Despite the Hellcat's success in combat, most Hellcat losses did not occur in dogfights. They occurred during training and routine operations. Learning to fly from aircraft carriers in World War II was extraordinarily dangerous. Pilots trained in single-seat fighters with no instructor in the cockpit. Mistakes were often fatal. Carrier landings were among the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. There were no angled decks, no advanced landing systems, and little room for error. Pilots relied on hand signals from landing officers standing on the deck. Night landings were even more terrifying. Many pilots later admitted that landing on a carrier in darkness was more stressful than facing enemy fighters. Mechanical failures, blown tires, and misjudged approaches led to countless crashes. Aircraft slid across decks, struck other planes, or tumbled into the sea. Even experienced pilots were not immune. Fatigue, weather, and the relentless pace of operations took their toll. Life aboard a carrier was defined by tension and routine. Pilots lived in cramped quarters below deck. They slept when they could, ate when they could, and were always on call. Takeoffs and landings happened around the clock. The deck crew worked in deafening noise, surrounded by spinning propellers and blazing exhaust. Pilots who missed the deck faced another danger: the ocean. Ditching a single-engine fighter was often deadly. The nose-heavy design caused aircraft to flip on impact. Many pilots chose to bail out rather than attempt a water landing. Even after escaping the aircraft, they faced the risk of being struck by the carrier itself or pulled under by its massive wake. Rescue destroyers followed carriers specifically to pick up downed pilots. But rescue was not guaranteed. The Pacific was vast, and many who went into the water were never recovered. By late 1944, a new terror emerged. Facing mounting losses, Japan turned to suicide attacks. Kamikaze aircraft aimed directly for American ships, turning themselves into guided missiles. Hellcat pilots became the front line of defense, scrambling to intercept attackers before they reached the fleet. These missions were psychologically draining. Kamikaze pilots did not break off. They flew straight through defensive fire. Interceptions often occurred at low altitude and high speed, leaving little time to react. Even when intercepted, debris from exploding aircraft could damage ships or injure deck crews. The sense of constant threat never left the carrier decks. The enemy could appear at any moment, from any direction. There was no true safe zone. The Hellcat was not the fastest fighter of the war. It was not the most agile. On paper, some American fighters could outperform it, but none matched its combination of ruggedness, ease of production, and forgiving flight characteristics. Grumman produced Hellcats in enormous numbers. Losses could be replaced quickly. New pilots could be trained faster and survive longer. Japan could not match this pace. Its industrial base struggled. Pilot training programs could not replace experienced aviators quickly enough. As the war dragged on, the quality gap between American and Japanese pilots widened dramatically. The air war became a war of attrition that Japan could not win. By the end of the war, newer fighters were already appearing. The Hellcat was beginning to show its age. But it had done its job. It had helped wrest control of the skies from Japan and protect the fleets that carried the war across the Pacific. For the pilots who flew it, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a shield. It was a second chance. Many owed their lives not to superior tactics or perfect flying, but to the simple fact that their aircraft was built to bring them home. And yet, the cruel irony remains. For many Hellcat pilots, the most dangerous enemy was never the Zero. It was the moment they lined up with a moving deck in the dark, hoping the wire would catch.